Guess who's back and ready to suffer again? That's right, even after putting myself through 2 Nuzlockes, I still haven't gotten tired of being beaten down and bullied by arbitrary video game challenges. However, this time, it's not something I'm putting myself through that's separate from the game itself. The challenge is the game, and it's got to do with that other Japanese 90s to 2000s multimedia kids phenomenon. That's right, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is getting its time to shine on this channel. Ah yes, we all know Yu-Gi-Oh! What began as a manga about gaming by the late great Kazuki Takahashi quickly exploded into a worldwide phenomenon, with the likes of anime, movies, card games, and of course, video games. There have been several dozen Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games over the past quarter of a century, many of which serve as adaptations of the anime that was running at the time of release. However, very few of these games are nearly as cheap, frustrating, and outright bullshit as the subject for this video. Yu-Gi-Oh! Reshef of Destruction for the Game Boy Advance. For a bit of backstory, Reshef of Destruction is the sequel to Yu-Gi-Oh! The Sacred Cards, which released on GBA in 2002 in Japan, 2003 elsewhere. Sacred Cards was essentially an adaptation of the Battle City arc, but starring a generic self-insert OC. You take the place of Yugi in many major battles from the arc, up to and including defeating the big bad, Merrick, at the end of the game. It's probably the easiest Yu-Gi-Oh! Game, you could beat this thing in a lazy afternoon, but Reshef of Destruction is the exact opposite. It released only a year after its predecessor, and I can only assume the developers took personal offense to the criticisms about Sacred Cards' short length and easy difficulty, because they were out for blood this time around. It's a larger, more sprawling game with an original story and absolutely brutal difficulty. One of my greatest regrets is never beating this game as a kid. I got close to the end, but got stuck and was too stubborn or tunnel vision to try looking up what to do. Well, I've decided I'm going to put this to rest and finally beat Reshef of Destruction. After our ominous opening, featuring a villainous character who doesn't seem familiar in the slightest, we cut to our protagonist hanging out with everyone's favorite Brooklynite, Joey Wheeler. We're comparing decks while preparing for a tournament on board the Duel Express, but it seems like Yugi's running a bit late. Speak of the devil, he comes running in, yelling about how the Millennium Puzzle has gone missing, so we set out in search of it. Soon after, Ishizu shows up to dump the game's backstory on us like she's the exposition fairy or something. It turns out that someone is trying to resurrect Reshef the Dark Being, who could destroy the world if set loose, and we need to find the missing Millennium items to beat him by using them to restore the Egyptian god cards, which have been turned to stone. Of course we agree, and Ishizu uses her lingering connection to the Millennium items to tell us that the first item is at the Egypt exhibition. So with our first goal set, it's time to get this journey on the road. Or not. You see, our starting deck is absolutely terrible, with the likes of Mechanical Spider, Dancing Elf, and Monster Eye being included. This is the kind of game where you start out with Tatsuno Otoshigo, a 1 tribute monster with 1350 attack and no effect. And for a while, it's actually viable. With a deck like this, the first boss is more likely to stomp us than not, so we've got to go grind against Yugi, Joey, Tristan, and Duke at the card shop. These are the most easily accessible duelists that can be rematched for the majority of the game, so we'll be getting quite familiar with their decks. Tristan is the easiest of the 4, with no monsters above 500 attack and no spell or trap cards, so he goes down easily, though he doesn't really give anything worthwhile until much later. Duke is trickier, maybe a bit better than your starting deck, but he gives some good rewards, like 700 attack monsters, including Hourglass of Life. This card is indispensable in the early game, as it boosts the attack and defense of all monsters on your field for the cost of 1,000 life points. However, there is a catch that turns this card into more of a risk-reward factor. Unlike pretty much every other Yu-Gi-Oh! Game, your life points don't automatically replenish between duels. You have to use the PC at your house if you want to get back to 8,000, and this is a game that expects you to get through gauntlets of duelists without being able to heal up in between matches. There aren't too many parts of the game where it's a big issue, at most your house is maybe a minute away, but it can get tedious having to re-enter and re-exit the same few areas over and over just to top up your life points. Moving on, Joey and Yugi are nowhere near the level you'd expect them to be if you've watched the anime, but they're still tougher than Tristan and Duke. Joey throws out monsters with 4-digit defense, which you won't have many answers against, and he can use those walls to build up tribute fodder for his Flame Swordsman, Thousand Dragon, and Red Eye's Black Dragon. Yugi, meanwhile, uses some pretty strong traps and spells for this point, like Horn of the Unicorn and Monster Reborn, and of course has some strong tribute monsters like Curse of Dragon and Dark Magician. Thankfully, you can also get those kinds of cards as rewards for beating these two, so that's neat. It is possible to beat them with just your starting deck, but you're unlikely to come out unscathed, and that means making your way back home to heal up, which will be happening a lot while you're grinding. Now, you might be wondering what's up with the gameplay, which is a bit different from the actual card game. Similar to certain other games like Dark Duel Stories and the aforementioned Sacred Cards, Reshef of Destruction uses a simplified version of the rules to the real-life card game. Many cards have different effects from the ones they have in the real game, with some of them emulating combos from the Duelist Kingdom arc, like Curse of Dragon being able to burn the field into a wasteland, or Castle of Dark Illusions keeping the field as Yami while it's out and flipping its user's monsters face down. The bigger change compared to the real-life game, however, is the element system. These games use a rock-paper-scissors system when it comes to elements, where monsters of a certain element will always beat monsters of a certain other element, regardless of attack and defense. This is similar to certain interactions from the Duelist Kingdom arc, like Mai's flying harpy ladies having an advantage over Joey's earthbound warriors. There are 2 separate elemental trees that circle in on themselves, and then there's Divine type, which is a special little snowflake that, much like sheer heart attack, has no weaknesses. Knowing how the element system works is essential when it comes to making your way through this game, so if you make a rookie mistake like thinking that wind beats forest when it's really the other way around, you're gonna have a bad time. On the other hand, knowing which elements a duelist specializes in means that you can load your deck up with counters that allow you to stomp them into the ground, even if you have weaker cards than they do. With the grinding out of the way and a halfway competent deck built up, we could move on and actually begin the story proper. Or we can go over to Kaiba Corp to find Rebecca Hawkins harassing Kaiba. There are a few optional side stories like this as long as you go to the right places at the right time. Rebecca trying to beat Kaiba to avenge the blue eyes her grandfather gave to Yugi's grandfather, Tristan and Duke trying to become better duelists to impress Serenity, some adult men sexually harassing the teenage Taya. They're there if you want to engage in them, but they don't really provide anything worthwhile. These side stories usually just amount to some silly scenarios that didn't happen in the anime/manga, references to scenarios that did happen, and a duel or two for good measure. Anyway, Kaiba Corp also houses the Battle Computer, an opponent whose difficulty you can set, and another prime source for grinding. Beginner is at the same level as Tristan, I didn't bother with normal, and Expert is on the same level as endgame enemies, who outright cheat. If you've ever wanted to experience Hydrogen Bomb versus Coughing Baby from the side of the Coughing Baby, picking Expert at the beginning of the game isn't the worst way to do that. Alright, that's enough dawdling, let's get the actual plot on the road. To get to the Egypt exhibition, we first have to get on board the Duel Express. These guards say we have to beat them in a duel to earn passage on the train, but with my new deck, it wasn't much of a challenge. This is the first required duel of the game, so of course it wouldn't be too hard. Once on board, we beat everyone in this first car before being confronted by Panic, who says he'll never let us get the Millennium items. The train goes through a tunnel here, changing the field to Yami, which gives his dark monsters a boost, but even so, he's not too tough. After the duel, the train pulls into our destination, and Panic pushes past us to try to get to the Millennium item before we can, but he gets clapped by Bootleg Shoddy here in the time it takes us to walk across a few screens. This is the Millennium Guardian, and we need to beat him in order to get the Millennium Necklace. Honestly, even as a kid, I never had much trouble with this guy, so with the grinding I did earlier, he's easy pickings. We get the Millennium Necklace, which gives us a vision of what'll happen if we don't stop Reshef, and it certainly isn't pretty. Some pharaohs just want to watch the world burn. On our way out, we bump into the Kaiba brothers, with Seto exuding the same Vegeta energy as usual, and refusing to team up with a bunch of friendship-obsessed losers like us. Anyway, we report back to Ishizu, but before she can tell us where the next Millennium item is, we're ambushed by this weird magician-looking dude. This is the Puppeteer of Doom, who's trying to stop us from interfering with the plans of his master. You might be wondering just who this guy is, and why he never showed up in the anime. Well, if you remember those episodes where Yugi duels a Kaiba imposter who turns out to be his former darkness in the form of this weird clown, the Puppeteer of Doom is essentially the original manga version of that guy. He used the creepy dummy modeled after Kaiba because Kaiba was in a coma after the Death Tea arc, which was severely shortened into the first episode of the Duel Monsters anime. Can't believe they cut Kaiba hiring professional assassins and an actual serial killer to get back at Yugi for beating him in a card game. Back to the game, Puppeteer of Doom is a bit harder than the Millennium Guardian since the Yami field boosts his monsters, but he goes down without much of a fight. Afterward, he gives us a card containing a video message from Sol Chavalsky, that oddly familiar looking guy from the beginning of the game. He challenges us to awaken the God cards and bring them to his castle before Reshef is brought back. I mean, I was planning on fixing the God cards, but thanks for the extra motivation, I guess. Ishizu reiterates that we need the Millennium items to awaken the God cards and directs us to a cruise ship at Domino Pier. On board, we find Mai Valentine being harassed by Jean-Claude Magnum. You may remember him from a filler episode of the anime, or from an optional duel in Sacred Cards. Well, we need Mai's permission to get to the area of the ship with the Millennium item, so we have to take care of Magnum for her if we want to get past. He's a total pushover, and Mai gives us access to the back of the ship, where we have to go up against another Millennium Guardian for the Millennium Key. This guy's a jump up in difficulty, using no tribute monsters with 1000 attack at a point where you can't even hope to have something like that in your deck. Nothing a bit of perseverance can't solve though, as we get the Millennium Key, and with it, a vision of Shadi. He tells us that the Millennium items contain memories of their owners that will guide us, and then just vanishes. Honestly, that's some pretty typical Shadi behavior right there. Getting back to Ishizu, the first two Millennium items bring Slifer the Sky Dragon back to normal, with Ishizu saying that it chooses Yugi as its user. Unfortunately, he's not the protagonist of this game, so he lets us use it instead. With one God card back, we now have to go to the catacombs in Italy. Yeah, it turns out this is a globe-trotting adventure, and I can only assume Ishizu has a private jet or something that she's letting us use, because that's the only way I can see these trips going so smoothly that they're nothing more than a screen transition. In the catacombs, we meet Bones, who's working as a tour guide, and question him about the Millennium items. He says he'll reveal what he knows if we can beat him, and while he does have a pretty strong no-tribute monster in Crass Clown, he goes down pretty easily. Afterwards, Bandit Keith shows up with the rare hunters in tow. He tries to act all tough, but come on, this is the guy that got clapped by Joey back in Duelist Kingdom, even when he was cheating his heart out. It turns out that after we beat Merrick in Sacred Cards, Keith gathered up the remnants of the rare hunters and reformed them as the Neo-Ghouls. Arcana shows up to give Keith some information, and he says he wants to use the God cards to thrash that arrogant punk. I can only assume he means Pegasus, considering that the other guy he'd have a grudge against is right in front of him. He claims we won't find what we're looking for here and just leaves. Doesn't even bother trying to stop us or anything. While I'm on the topic of Bandit Keith, did you know that he's canonically only 26 years old? I'd always assumed he was supposed to be in his 30s, but no, Yu-Gi-Oh! Wiki says he's 26, which was incredibly distressing for me to learn shortly after turning 27. How am I older than this guy? Anyway, Bones takes us to a secret passage where we battled the third Millennium Guardian. Neo-Ghouls couldn't think to just look behind a wall, SMH. Anyway, we get the Millennium Ring from this guy, with a vision of Yami Bakura spouting some more ominous lines as his only contribution to the plot. Can't believe this is the treatment the main villain of OG Yu-Gi-Oh's final arc gets. Getting back to Ishizu, she expresses worry over Bandit Keith's sudden involvement in the plot, before telling us that the next Millennium item is at the Great Wall of China. There are these two bald guys here that won't let us progress, and Joey feels something fishy about them. Try to duel the one at the noodle stand, and bet you didn't see this one coming, they turn out to be the Paradox Brothers. And I've gotta say, their theme is probably my favorite track in the game. The Paradox Brothers are working for Sol Chavalsky, just like they worked for a certain other silver-haired red-clad villain. I've almost got it worked out, guys. Just give me a minute and I'll figure out just who this mystery man is. We face off with Para here, and I'd say this is the point where the game starts to show its true colors. All enemies from this point onward have high-powered monsters and some pretty scummy spells and traps. Even if you've been keeping up with your deck building and grinding, a lot of the remaining duels are tough to overcome without a healthy dose of luck. After finally defeating Para, he calls Dox over to tag duel us, and he comes flipping over in a pretty fancy animation. The game designers could have just as easily used a regular walk cycle, but they made the Paradox Brothers as extra as they are in canon. I love it. Kaiba shows up to act as our tag team partner, and so we're thrown into another tough duel right after the last tough duel. Great. After we chase them off, Kaiba throws out some typical Kaiba dialogue about how he'll be the one to defeat Sol Chevalsky instead of us. Anyway, time to duel another Millennium Guardian who's not quite on the level of the Paradox Brothers, but is still pretty difficult. It seems like every single one of his monsters has at least 1,000 attack, and we still can't even hope to match that. Even so, with some good RNG, we make it through and get the Millennium Eye, which gives us a vision of Sol Chevalsky. My god, I finally understand. Sol Chevalsky is actually Ushio, the bully from the first chapter of the manga! It all makes sense! Seriously though, if you didn't see it coming that Sol Chevalsky is actually Pegasus, I worry for you. Anyway, he eggs us on a bit and then dips, so cool. Ishizu is somehow shocked to learn that Sol Chevalsky is actually Pegasus, but we don't have time to dwell on that because it's time to resurrect Obelisk the Tormentor. Hell yeah, this is the coolest looking of the Egyptian god cards. It's blue, it's one of the signature cards of one of my favorite characters. I am so hyped to use Obelisk. But I can't just yet. It turns out Obelisk still wants Kaiba to use it, and fair enough. If I was a Yu-Gi-Oh card, I'd want to be used by Kaiba too. Before Ishizu can reveal the location of the next Millennium item though, Tristan comes strolling in talking about how Serenity wants to go see the Kaiba Man show. Ishizu encourages us to go, because who cares about stopping a potential apocalypse when you can go see a fun little stage play instead? It's not like we know just how much destruction Reshef is gonna cause or anything. We rush over to Kaiba Corp, where we see the Big Five begging Mokuba for their jobs back. I guess since the Virtual World arc never happened in this continuity, they're able to get jobs, but not the ones that they expected. At the show, we don't see Serenity even though she went ahead of us, until she comes running on stage, chased by the Big Five, dressed as their deck masters from the Virtual World arc. We have to defeat the Big Five to save Serenity, because of course we do. They have some strong monsters and shitty spells, but are a cakewalk compared to the past few duels. After winning the duel, the Big Five fuse into Five-Headed Dragon, but Kaiba Man shows up to defeat them with Dragon Master Knight. I get the reference! It's like that one time in the anime! Afterwards, we see that Kaiba Man was played by Roland, Kaiba's right-hand man, and the Big Five are understandably miffed about their new job. With that diversion out of the way, we head back to Ishizu, who tells us that the next Millennium item is at an archaeological dig site in Canada. There, we start experiencing earthquakes, apparently from the process of Reshef's resurrection, and have to duel Rex Raptor to get to the back of the cave where the next Millennium Guardian is. He's a really tough opponent, with monsters of high strength and varying types, and his dinosaurs getting a boost from the Wasteland field. It takes me a while to get past him, but I eventually manage it and move on to the 5th Millennium Guardian. Thankfully, he goes down much easier, and we get the Millennium Rod. The Vision of Merrick promises that we'll meet again, and then we're hit with another earthquake, so I'd say it's time to leave. Back with Ishizu, it seems like the earthquakes are getting worse, so she sends us to the Galapagos Islands to look for the 6th Millennium item. Looking it up, the Galapagos consist of 127 landmasses. So how the hell do we immediately land on the right one? Somehow Mako Tsunami and Weevil Underwood are also here with no worries, so I guess this specific island is just easily accessible? I don't know. While you don't need to duel either of them, Mako is the first duelist that can be rematched at will since the beginning of the game. With this in mind, if you stack your deck with electric monsters, you can beat him as many times as you want for some pretty good rewards. Fiend Kraken ended up being one of the best no-tribute monsters in my deck for most of the rest of the playthrough, but the real prize here is Kairyu Shin. It's a 1-tribute monster with pretty good stats, and the effect of turning the field into the water-themed Umi, giving it a nice power boost. Sure, it doesn't guarantee a win, but it's a great asset that helps carry you through some really tough battles ahead. As I was grinding here, my duelist level finally hit 150, and this is as good a time as any to explain this whole thing. This game and Sacred Cards include the duelist level and deck capacity systems. Basically, every card has a deck cost, and the total deck cost of all cards in your deck has to be equal to or less than your current deck capacity. While you could raise deck capacity incredibly quickly in Sacred Cards, thanks to certain mandatory duels giving you boatloads of the stuff, Reshef of Destruction gives, at most, 3 deck capacity per duel, with most enemies only giving 1. Basically, since grinding up your deck capacity takes forever and is incredibly tedious, you can't use cards with higher deck costs, i.e. the cards you would want to use, without also including cards with much lower deck cost. That's not all, as you can only include cards in your deck that have a deck cost that is equal to or less than your current duelist level. You gain duelist level by winning duels, but it only goes up by a rate of 1 level for every 3 or 4 duels. What this all means is that you have to grind for hours on end if you want to have a deck full of actually useful cards, rather than needing to include weaker cards to balance them out. Now, why did I feel the need to bring up that my duelist level hit 150? Well, when I was researching this game and some of the best cards to use, I found out that Dark Flare Knight is pretty broken in this game. So broken that you can only have 1 copy in your deck. A 1 Tribute 2200 attack monster would be fine on its own, but its effect is what makes it so useful. When Dark Flare Knight is sent to the graveyard, which is as easy as just discarding it from your hand, it summons a Mirage Knight to your field, which is a much more powerful monster than most non-god cards you'll be able to use in a normal playthrough. At the end of your turn, it splits into Dark Magician and Flame Swordsman, the fusion materials for Dark Flare Knight in the actual game. Getting 2 powerful monsters out on the field like this is an easy way to turn the tables in your favor, and it's the kind of card that will carry you through most of the rest of the game. The only reason I wasn't able to use it before, despite using the password machine to get it as early as possible, was its deck cost of 150, but now that I have the proper duelist level, it's going into the deck and never leaving. Further in the island, we come across Iyami Yugi collecting the Millennium Scales? That shouldn't be possible. He tells us to hand over the other Millennium items, but we know that Yami Yugi would never speak the way this guy does, so we refuse, and he gets all flustered. He eventually mutters that his disguise is perfect, and there's no getting out of this situation, so the fake Yugi reveals that he's actually that clown that Yugi dueled in the anime that took the place of Puppeteer of Doom. Okay, these two have never coexisted in the same continuity before, so what the hell is going on here? Considering that Puppeteer of Doom only showed up for that single duel earlier and then disappeared from the plot, while this guy, the Mimic of Doom, shows up again later, why couldn't Puppeteer's role have been filled by Mimic so as not to have a completely redundant character as well as timeline confusion? Moving on, Mimic of Doom challenges us for all the Millennium items we have and ends up being a really difficult boss. I was making attempts on him in between grinding attempts on Mako, so for most of these I didn't have Dark Flare Knight and got stomped. It was a lot of trial and error, but eventually I was able to eke out a win. Mimic of Doom flees in disgrace, leaving behind the Millennium Scales like a dope. Shoddy congratulates us on getting 6 of the Millennium items, trust me, that is an actual achievement in this game, and tells us that Pegasus is also a victim of Reshef, having been swallowed up by his darkness. So now we have to save not only the world, but also Pegasus from Reshef's evil. You would think that having 6 Millennium items would awaken the Winged Dragon of Ra, but instead, both Slifer and Obelisk get turned back to stone. Even Ishizu doesn't fully understand and just tells us to raise our duelist level. Did you not just hear me talk about getting it high enough to use one of the best cards in the game? What more do you want from me? Tristan's dog shows up, causing Joey to think something has happened to Tristan, and despite the desperation of the current situation, Ishizu just lets us go on this side quest. I'm not joking, this is actually a continuation of the earlier side quest where Tristan and Duke try to become better duelists that just causes the plot to screech to a halt if you finish that side quest. Following the dog to the card shop, Duke and Serenity tell us that they saw a robot monkey exit the shop, act all lovey towards Serenity, and act friendly with Tristan's dog. So obviously Tristan has been turned into a robot monkey as a side effect of Reshef's resurrection. When Duke said Tristan may not be able to turn back to normal, the monkey freaked out and ran away, so it's up to us to find it. Him? Whatever. Since the robot monkeys were manufactured by Kaiba Corp, we head over there to see if Mokuba has any leads on where it could have gone. He mentions that some of them were donated to an island, so we're going right back to the Galapagos, since that's the only island we can travel to. Once there, we see them gathering bananas, and when we enter the scene, one of them flees, while another challenges us to a duel. Because of course the robot monkeys are programmed to be able to duel, they're manufactured by Kaiba Corp, remember? The robot monkeys are actually pretty tough opponents, with a really powerful forest-themed deck, and the worst part is that you have to duel all 3 that are on this screen. Thankfully, the 4th that ran into the temple just uses the same deck as Tristan, so he's an absolute cakewalk. Taking him back to the card shop, Yugi's grandpa comes out and clarifies that the robot monkey was a product he was selling, and the real Tristan actually comes back from getting a bite to eat. So it was all just a wacky misunderstanding. If you actually want to play this game after watching this video, do yourself a favor and skip that Tristan side quest so you don't have to go through this one. Sure, you get to duel the monkey whenever you want afterwards, but it just uses the same deck as Tristan and gives the same shitty rewards. It's not even remotely worth it. Getting back on track, Ishizu says we need all 7 Millennium items to restore the God cards back to normal, and goes off to get the Millennium Puzzle herself, while sending us after Kaiba to get Obelisk. As you'd expect, Kaiba refuses to believe in what we have to say, and goes off on his own to find out how to get Obelisk back to normal. Leaving Kaiba Corp, we see that the Neo Ghouls are attacking anyone they can, with Seeker, the Exodia rare hunter, going after Esperoba's brothers. Espa shows up to save his brothers, and we team up with him to get rid of the Neo Ghouls. If it wasn't for my previous grinding against Mako and getting Dark Flare Knight, Seeker would be legitimately challenging. But with my deck the way it is now, he's a cakewalk. Even so, he claims that the Neo Ghouls can no longer be stopped before running away with piss leaking out of his pants. Espa tells us that Kaiba went chasing after Ishizu and the Neo Ghouls captured her and took her to the Egypt exhibition. Unfortunately, they're blocking our way through, so we're gonna need help getting rid of the Neo Ghouls lingering in town before we can save her. This initiates a segment where we have to travel back to major areas, take down the Neo Ghouls, and recruit the strongest duelists there to help us in Domino. We defeat Arcana at the cruise ship, Strings the Mime at the Galapagos, Loomis and Umbra in China, and some generic rare hunters in Italy and Canada, which allows us to recruit Mai, Mako, Weevil, Bones, and Rex to our cause. Some of these duels went much more smoothly than others, just be glad I'm giving you the cliff notes. Also, Strings gave me Revival Jam upon defeat. With this being a monster with decent stats that benefits from the Umi field and can clone itself upon being summoned, of course this is going in my deck at the first opportunity. Upon returning to town, we see Esperoba's brothers leave to see the Kaiba Man show, and Espa tells us there are only a few lingering Neo Ghouls left in town. But before we can take care of that, I do have to point out that the duelists we recruited can be found in town, can be dueled as much as you want with stronger decks, and give some pretty solid rewards. Cards like Torrential Tribute, Bear Trap, Invisible Wire, Infinite Dismissal, Cocoon of Evolution, Harpy's Feather Duster, and Amazon Archers will prove to be very useful in the endgame, and if you want them, you've got to duel these guys over and over again to try and get them. Please be grateful that I chose not to record that grind. It turns out that the remaining Neo Ghouls are at Kaiba Corp and interrupt the Kaiba Man show. When Seeker takes Kaiba Man down, the Big Five offer to work for the Neo Ghouls. Seeker tells them to attack Esperoba's brothers, but Espa shows up to face off with them while we go up against Seeker one last time. Even with a stronger deck, he can't hope to compare to my improved deck, and runs away like a little baby bitch yet again. Now that the Neo Ghouls have been run out of town, we can go save Ishizu! Boarding the Duel Express again, we have to go up against some more grunts, but they only have 2,000 life points each, so they're nothing more than speed bumps on our way to the Egypt exhibition. We see Kaiba holding off an endless wave of Neo Ghouls as we go into the back to confront Bandit Keith. He demands we hand over the Millennium items so he can use the Winged Dragon of Ra, and because he's holding Ishizu hostage, we have no choice but to comply. Believe it or not, Keith had the Millennium Puzzle, and with all 7 items, he brings Ra back and tries to use it against us. Now, I didn't get to see it thanks to how thoroughly I trounced him, but if Keith does manage to summon Ra, it's in its Sphere mode, meaning it has 0 attack and defense, and he tributes 3 monsters for essentially nothing. We see Slifer destroy the useless volleyball, as apparently each of the god cards have been reawakened. Keith freaks out and tries to play dirty as usual, but the Millennium Puzzle returns to Yugi, and as the Pharaoh makes it clear that Keith wasn't chosen by Ra, it strikes him down, putting an end to the Neo Ghouls once and for all. With that, we get access to the Winged Dragon of Ra. In its sphere mode, making it as useless as when Keith used it for now. Unfortunately, things can't be so easy, because Reshef possesses Keith and has him smash the Millennium Puzzle to pieces. While we do recover some of the pieces, Para takes the rest away to Pegasus's castle. Outside, while we do see that Obelisk is also back to normal, Dox captures Mokuba and challenges Kaiba to come to Pegasus's castle to save him. Even with the situation so dire, Kaiba still refuses to cooperate with us and runs off on his own. Afterward, a Millennium Guardian shows up and tells us that since we found all 7 Millennium items, we have to meet Paradox in China to get his help. Definitely not confusing to have a character named Paradox in the same game as the Paradox Brothers, especially when he's also gone by Simon or Shimon depending on the adaptation. We head to China, where Paradox tells us that the Winged Dragon of Ra hasn't fully awoken since it's in its sphere mode. We need to get it into its regular form. But who could possibly be able to do something like that? Talking to Ishizu reveals that the only 2 people who've deciphered the text on Ra are Kaiba, who's currently indisposed, and Merrick. Who would have thought that the guy who owned Ra in canon would know how to use it? Heading over to Egypt, we meet Odeon, who says that we can't see Merrick right now. We could duel him to earn the right, or we can say we'll just come back later, which causes Merrick to just let us see him right now. Taking the path of least resistance, we go into the shrine Merrick's praying at and explain the whole situation to him. He challenges us to see if we're capable of handling Ra's power, and he makes you work for that win. With cards like Swords of Revealing Light, Harpy's Feather Duster, Raigeki, and Des Volstgolf, which destroys one of your monsters and deals direct damage to you, you have to pull out all the stops against him and hope the RNG is in your favor if you want to get the win. Eventually we pull it off, and Merrick awakens the Winged Dragon of Ra's battle mode, so it's now actually useful. He does mention that he can't remember how to awaken Ra's third form, Phoenix mode, but we'll get to that in a bit. Returning to Paradox, we try to get him to tell us where Pegasus's castle is, but he decides to play a game with us first. Yeah, sure man, not like this is a pressing matter or anything. We have to catch Paradox and then duel him. And by that he means we have to duel our way through a gauntlet of Millennium Guardians. Thankfully, they each only have 3,000 life points, and they each give you a specific card after beating them. Once we get to Paradox, he quizzes us on the cards we were given, so I hope you were paying attention when you got them. After that, it's time to duel Paradox himself, and while he does have some strong cards and a full 8,000 life points, I was able to take him down easily. That said, he is essentially a graduation into the endgame, which features some of the cheapest, bullshittiest enemies in the game, so be prepared for that. He dispels the magical barrier around Pegasus's castle, but before we go there, we can now unlock Ra's Phoenix mode. Just input a password at the card shop and return to Egypt, and you get a monster with a similar effect to Dark Flare Knight, except it summons Ra's battle form, a divine attribute 4000 attack and defense monster, when sent to the graveyard. Having both Dark Flare Knight and Ra Phoenix mode in your deck turns much of the rest of the game into seeing how long you can last until you draw one of them, or seeing how quickly you demolish your opponent if you manage to draw them in your opening hand. Ishizu meets us at Pegasus's island, where she warns us about the battles to come, and we use this cable car to advance. Inside, Joey questions what caused Pegasus to fall so low, but then we're ambushed by this weird green thing. This is a Chevalier, which is apparently an elite duelist transformed into a freak by Pegasus. I turned these guys into pickles, Yugi boy! They're Pickle Pegasus! Funniest shit I've ever seen! Its deck isn't anything too threatening, but it does start out with 10,000 life points, which is annoying. After beating it, 2 more Chevaliers jump in, and you have to duel them back to back, with them also starting at 10,000 life points. Hooray! We get off the cable car afterwards and immediately get ambushed by Panic and Mimic of Doom, who you battle in a tag duel alongside Joey. Regardless of which opponent you pick, they have really strong decks and start out with a whopping 15,000 life points. While I do eventually win, they decide that they can just keep challenging us to duels to keep us here. So Joey has me and Yugi go on ahead and stays behind to duel both of them on his own. Heading into the dungeon, we see Pegasus send more Chevaliers after us, and we have to make our way through another 3 of these fuckers. Each Chevalier uses different types in their decks, so we have to prepare for each one individually, and they still all start with 10,000 life points. At the end of the dungeon, we get confronted by the Paradox Brothers and have to duel them in another tag duel where they start with 15,000 life points. It's another duel where they use some shitty cards, but I pull out the win after a few tries. They try to pull the same stalling nonsense that Panic and Mimic of Doom did, but Yugi keeps them at bay while I continue onward past this lone chevalier who I don't even need to duel. He's just standing in the middle of the screen, blocking nothing like an idiot. Before I can enter the castle proper, Paradox appears and tells me that the castle is actually a labyrinth that'll never end unless I get spirit cards from duelists I've bonded with. This means that I have to duel against Mai, Mako, Rex, Bones, and Weevil yet again, and Esperoba for the first time, to get the cards that they say contain their spirits. And of course their decks have been improved since I was grinding against them, so they're even harder. Thanks to the increased difficulty, this leads to nearly an hour of padding before I can finally enter Pegasus's castle. Once inside, Pegasus tells me that he's turned the spirits of the duelists I've defeated into dark duelists, which means I have to go up against the 6 that I just beat yet again, but with even harder decks and 10,000 life points. It's so tedious and repetitive, just dueling the same enemies over and over after I'd already spent way too much time grinding against them earlier. Was there really nothing they could think of to at least make the final dungeon somewhat interesting and engaging? The closest thing to that is after you beat the Dark Duelists, where you can find this room with a picture of Shoddy, who shows up to dump the backstory of how Pegasus became ensnared by Reshef's darkness, but it's just a wall of sterile text with a slowed down version of Ishizu's theme playing. Why is the backstory of one of our main villains optional? Further in the castle, I come across Kaiba just finishing off a Chevalier. When Ishizu shows up and tells Kaiba that he can't win even with Obelisk, he does his typical bragging about how nobody can beat him. Just then, Mokuba shows up, brainwashed by Pegasus, and challenges Kaiba. Since Kaiba refuses to duel his brother, I have to take his place, and he goes down without much of a fight, despite having some cheap cards and 10,000 life points. Defeating him frees him from Pegasus's control, so Kaiba says he'll hand over Obelisk if I can beat him in a duel. He has a bunch of really strong monsters, but thankfully he has the normal 8,000 life points, so a couple direct attacks from Ra put him down. With that, I finally have the third and final God card, and I've only gotten it directly before the final bosses. I finally confront Pegasus with Ishizu, and despite her best efforts, he's fully succumbed to Reshef's evil, and he says that Reshef's about to level up, and I look like just enough XP. Pegasus uses his usual toon-themed monsters, alongside multiple copies of cards that you can only use one of, and having 20,000 life points. He uses cards like Relinquished, Thousand Eyes Restrict, and Change of Heart to steal your non-god monsters, so cards like Mirage Knight and Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth aren't even a guarantee that you'll win. His red archery girls can even lower the attack of your monsters, including gods, so you need to make sure that he doesn't use it in tandem with his monster stealing effects. If you can draw raw Phoenix mode early enough, you're more or less good, but you need to make sure not to lose too much life points, because you will need them for what follows. After a hard-fought duel, Pegasus is brought down by an assault from all 3 god cards, sending him flying into Reshef's seal. This kickstarts Reshef's revival, but returns Pegasus to his senses, and he starts angsting about the trouble he caused. With enough negative energy from defeated duelists, Reshef appears in a very confusing scene perspective-wise. Is he far off in the distance? Are we all floating above him? How does this work? Also, you can utterly ruin the intended drama of this scene by using a password at the card shop to turn Reshef into Goemon Impact from the Mystical Ninja series. I'm gonna be honest, I find this even more terrifying than Reshef's canon design. While Pegasus has resigned himself to doom, and even Ishizu doubts we can win, Kaiba, Yugi, and Joey show up to lend their support. The pieces of the Millennium Puzzle that Pegasus had return to Yugi, letting Yami Yugi take over, and he, Joey, and Kaiba attack Reshef with their signature monsters. Now it's up to me to finish this once and for all. If you thought Pegasus was cheap, he's got nothing on Reshef. Along with being able to use multiple copies of limited cards, he has some of the best monsters in the game, including all 3 god cards, can see your hand at all times, and thus knows what you're going to do at all times, and has a colossal 40,000 life points. He's outright cheating and proud of it! Even with the best deck possible, it won't help if your RNG gives you shit hands early on, especially if you took significant damage from Pegasus just before. The worst part is that if you want another shot at Reshef, you have to go through Pegasus all over again. Having to fight the 2 cheapest bosses in the game back to back over and over again for hours on end has to be the most tedious, mind-numbing, and outright unfun thing I've ever experienced in my life. The only thing that kept me pushing through all of it was the thought that I've been wanting to beat this thing for nearly 20 years, and that victory was finally within my grasp. If I didn't beat this thing now, I was never going to do it, and I couldn't just let all that grinding, researching, and constantly going back and forth between the same areas go to waste. Eventually, the RNG was just right, and I was finally able to pull out the win. I told you Ra's Phoenix mode was one of the most broken cards in the game, and with a combination of top-decking it and just the right draws, the victory that had been eluding me for God knows how many years was finally mine. Reshef tries possessing Pegasus again, but he fights it off long enough to get us to seal him alongside Reshef. Yeah, sure man, anything to be done with this goddamn game once and for all. The castle starts to collapse, but we manage to escape on Kaiba's helicopter. We make it back home safely, the real victory was the friends we made along the way, the god cards need to be sealed again, blah blah blah. I don't care about this ending, just roll credits, I'm done with this shit. Hold on though, what about the reward we get for beating the game? Well, if you reload your save, you'll find out that you can access a new location called the Hall of Eternity. Here you can challenge a bunch of super bosses, namely Paradox, Pegasus, Shadi, Kaiba, Noah Kaiba, Possessed Joey, Yami Merrick, Yami Bakura, and Yami Yugi. They all have decks on par with the final bosses, and anywhere from 30,000 to 60,000 life points. If you really don't have anything better to do, or you just want to flex that you can take on anything this game can throw at you, go ahead and duel these guys. As for me, now that I've finally beaten the game, I have no real reason to ever play it ever again. So, now that I've finally beaten the game that's haunted me since I was 8, what are my final thoughts on it? I'm gonna be blunt, this game is cheap, frustrating, tedious, overly grindy, and filled to the brim with bullshit. No other Yu-Gi-Oh game is anywhere near this player-unfriendly, and I say that with full confidence despite not having played Forbidden Memories. Yeah, I know that game doesn't have the best reputation either, but you can't seriously tell me that it's a worse experience than this game. I would absolutely not recommend that you try this game out. At least, not in its vanilla form. Reddit user Ephraim226 made a mod for this game called Reshef is actually tolerable now, and it includes a bunch of quality of life changes. Your life points replenish between duels, duelist level does nothing now, and deck costs have been adjusted to account for that, that permanent effect scanner thing that happens with every action has been removed, and a bunch of cards now have more accurate stats and effects. Granted, I'm not going to try it out since I just spent over a fucking month playing through this game, and as I said, I wouldn't touch it again with a 50-foot pole, but if you really want to try Reshef of Destruction out for your own, this mod is the way to go. As for the next challenge I undertake, well, I know what it's gonna be already, but I want to take a little time to prepare for it. I hope you'll tune into that video as well. Thanks for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments about any other games you'd like to see me cover. I want to give a special thanks to Alpharad, JaidenAnimations, and Bumbles McFumbles, as this video's style was inspired by each of them in various ways. See you in the next video, bye!